fourth reading class or preparing for the May test. Today we are going to be going through the first three passages from practice test 5. So to all who are listening at this point, go ahead and get a test, print it off. It's helpful to have it right in front of you so you can mark it up as we go. And we will be going through the literature passage, the double passage, that's a history passage, and then lastly, I believe it's a social science passage, either science or social science. All right, so I will begin sharing my screen right now. Looks like it's working. First passage, this one, as always, is our literature passage. And we have, let's just read the little blurb here. It says this passage is adapted from William Maxwell, The Folded Leaf, written in 1959, originally published in 1945. Okay, so it looks like it was published before and then published again. I don't know. Let me get my pencil out. Okay. The Alcazar restaurant was on Sheridan Road near Devon Avenue. It was long and narrow, with tables for 2 along the walls and tables for 4 down the middle. The decoration was art modern, or whatever, except for the series of murals depicting the 4 seasons and the sick ferns in the front window. This is an interesting description here of this restaurant, Alcazar Restaurant. We have no idea what we've stepped into at this point, but they're kind of setting the stage for us. Some modern art, except for some murals of the 4 seasons. There's some sick ferns in the front window. I like that detail. I think that's very artistic. So first little section, we have just the setting. Now we find a character. Named Limey. So Limey sat down at the second table from the cash register and ordered his dinner. The history book, which he propped against the ketchup and the glass sugar bowl, had been used by others before him. Blank pages, front and back, were filled in with maps, drawings, dates, comic cartoons, and organs of the body, also with names and messages no longer clear and never absolutely legible. On nearly every other page, there was some marginal notation, either in ink or in very hard pencil. So we have this history book, which seems pretty interesting. It looks like it's a book that lots of people have been using. There's cartoons in it. There's names, messages, things you can't read anymore. It looks like a very old book, something that people have been reading for a long time, something that people have really enjoyed. And this little interesting detail here at the end. And unless someone had upset a glass of water, the marks on page 177 were from tears. I like that. So we have a restaurant, description of the restaurant. We have a character that comes into the story and a description of what he's doing. He's just sitting at a table, ordered his dinner, and now it describes the history book that he is probably going to be reading. When Limey read about the Peace of Paris, signed on the 30th of May, 1814, between France and the Allied powers, his right hand managed again and again to bring food up to his mouth. So he's super intrigued by this. He's reading about some historical event, but his eating is just out of natural habit. It's just happening. Sometimes he chewed, sometimes he swallowed whole the food that he had no idea he was eating. This is like when you're so into something that you can't even think about your other senses. You're just totally involved in what you're reading about. If you guys can read this way, you're going to do great on this test. Totally engrossed. The Congress of Vienna, now we're back into what's happening in the book. The Congress of Vienna met, with some allowance for delays, early in November of the same year, and all the powers engaged in the war on either side sent plenipotentiaries. I looked this up a second ago. and this means basically diplomats. So they all sent diplomats. It was by far the most splendid and important assembly ever convoked. Never heard that word before. Sounds like invoked and convened. I'm assuming it means just joined together. Ever come together to discuss and determine the affairs of Europe. The Emperor of Russia, the King of Prussia, the Kings of Bavaria, Denmark, and Württemberg all were present in person at the court of the Emperor Francis I in the Austrian capital. So this has basically been a description of the history that he's reading about in the book. If you were to buzz through the questions before you read the passage, you'd notice that they don't really ask for any details about this history, which is kind of nice. Basically, it's just describing what Limey's reading. But they're not going to ask you questions about that, thankfully. Back to Limey. When Limey put down his fork and began to count them off, the people who were there, one by one on the fingers of his left hand, the waitress, whose name was Irma, thought he was through eating and tried to take his plate away. So he puts down his fork and starts counting on his fingers, and so this waitress, here's another character, she comes and tries to take his food away. He stopped her. Prince Metternich, his right thumb, presided over the Congress. And Prince Talleyrand, the index finger, represented France. So he's so into, basically they're just painting a picture of him being so into what he's reading that he's really not thinking about anything else. He's not thinking about the food that he's eating. He's just totally engrossed. Now a few more characters enter. Remember, we're in a restaurant. A party of 4, 2 men and 2 women, came into the restaurant, all talking at once, and took possession of the center table nearest Limey. So they sat down close to him. The women had shingled hair and short, tight skirts which exposed the underside of their knees, and when they sat down, one of the women had the face of a young boy, but disguised by one trick or another, rouge, lipstick, powder, wet bangs plastered against the high forehead, and a pair of long pendant earrings, to look like a woman of 35, which, as a matter of fact, she was. So she had a young face. So she tried to make herself look older to match where her age was. I can relate to that struggle. The men were older. They laughed more than there seemed to be any occasion for. These type of people, I understand how Limey feels. While they were deciding between soup and shrimp cocktail, and their laughter was too loud. But it was the women's voices, the terrible, not quite sober pitch of the women's voices, which caused Limey to skim over 2 whole pages without knowing what was on them. So these 4 people that come to the restaurant, are really kind of a nuisance to Limey. They're loud, they're flashy, they're not thinking about what's going on in Limey's book. They're not thoughtful and quiet like Limey is. So because of that, he's super distracted. He skims through 2 whole pages of the book, which he used to be, just a little bit ago, incredibly engrossed in, and totally doesn't even think about what he read. Fortunately, though, he realized this and went back. Otherwise, he might have never known about the secret treaty concluded between England, France, and Austria, and the pretensions of Prussia and Russia, acting in concert, seemed to threaten a renewal of the attack. The result of the Congress were stated clearly at the bottom of page 67 and at the top of page 68, but before Limey got halfway through them, a coat that he recognized as his father's was hung on the hook next to his chair. So he goes back to read what he had missed when he was distracted by this very distracting people, and he finds this amazing information, a secret treaty that he wouldn't have known about if he hadn't gone back. It continues describing a little bit, and then something else happens. This is important. A coat. And it's interesting how it starts with the coat. He just sees a coat there, and he knows, oh, my father's here. Limey closed the book and said, I didn't think you were coming. This writer is good. I like this. So the coat, he sees the coat, realizes his dad is there, and now the scene kind of shifts. Let's see what it shifts to. Time is probably no more unkind to sporting characters than it is to other people. But physical decay, unsustained by respectability, is somehow more noticeable. Mr. Peters' hair was turning gray, and his scalp showed through on top. So now we can connect the dots. Mr. Peters is Limey's dad, right? And it's talking here. This is kind of important. Time is probably no more kind of sporting character. So it looks like Mr. Peters used to be a sporting character. Um, so it's not like they grow older faster, but physical decay unsustained by respectability is somehow more noticeable. So he was getting older, that's the physical decay part. Unsustained by respectability basically means he's not kept himself respectable. Even though as he's got older, he somehow has not kept himself respectable. Not entirely sure what that means, but he seems the important part is that he's growing older and it's noticeable. You see it, you're like, oh. Um, Mr. Peters' hair was turning gray and his scalp showed through on top. He'd lost weight also. He no longer filled out his clothes the way he used to. So he's got thinner, his hair is thinning out. His color was poor, and the flower had disappeared from his buttonhole. In its place was an American Legion button. So this is just driving the change in Mr. Peters as he's got older. He doesn't wear a flower in his buttonhole anymore. His clothes aren't filled out as much because he's thinner. He doesn't have as much color to his face. But now, apparently, he himself was not aware that there had been any change. So even though Mr. Peters is obviously quite a bit older, obviously, um, you know, fading, um, he doesn't seem to realize that himself. He seems oblivious to that. And this is why. This is showing him being oblivious to it. He straightened his tie self-consciously. It's kind of a young person thing. Hopefully, as you get older, you lose some of that self-consciousness. And when Irma handed him a menu, that's the waitress, he gestured with it so that the two women at the next table would notice the diamond ring on the fourth finger of his right hand. So remember, these women at the other table are young women. So he still feels like he's a young guy. Um, he still wants to show off his diamond ring. He still straightens his tie self-consciously. He seems to have a young idea of himself, even though he's obviously aged so much. Both of these things, and also the fact that his hands showed signs of the manicurist, so he's taken careful care of his nails. One can blame on the young man who had his picture taken with a derby hat on the back of his head, and also sitting with a girl in the curve of the moon. When I read this, I was a little confused, but I ended up deciding that this young man here is talking about Mr. Peters when he was young, and it's describing things that he used to do as he was young. Sitting with the girl in the curve of the moon in a picture, taking a picture with a derby hat on the back of his head. Because the next sentence, the young man had never for 1 second deserted Mr. Peters. So this matches with the idea that I just had, that it's talking about him as a young man. Young man never left him. It's not like he grew up and the young man kind of faded away. It was still there. He was still acting and feeling like a younger person than he actually was. It says he was always there, tugging at Mr. Peters' elbow, making him do things that were not becoming in a man of 45. Interesting. We don't really get to hear the interaction between him and Limey. That's just not something we get to hear, sadly. Let's just summarize here really quick, because that's always a helpful thing to do once you've finished going through a passage, even as you're reading, during a test, an actual test. Just run through quickly, okay, what happened? So let's run through. Alcazar Restaurant describes a restaurant. We have this boy Limey sitting at a table reading a book. Old book, lots of people used it. Limey's intrigued with it. The stuff it's describing in history, so intriguing he can't even think about what he's eating. But then when four people come into the restaurant, describes how distracting they are. Limey gets distracted and he misses 2 pages. He has to go back. And good thing he did, because another important event in history, it was talking about that, and it would have been a shame for him to miss that. Then a coat. Coat comes on the hook next to his chair, and that's how the author introduces his father. then it just moves into a description of the father, um, talking about he's gotten a lot older, but he doesn't think he did. He doesn't see those things that other people see, and he still acts like a young man. And that is basically the summary of this passage. This passage is fairly simple. Honestly, I didn't look at the curve for this test, but at least the first 3 passages seem to be fairly simple. So I think it's an easy test, but you never know. I'll have to look at the curve. Okay, let's move on to the second passage. This one's kind of interesting. It's funny how they always have passages about, their history passages are often about women, either slavery or women. I'm not really sure why they always pick those, but it's a common theme. Okay, this time, even though it's always important to read the blurb, this blurb is very important and very helpful. Because you have to understand a little bit of what's going on before you jump in. Passage 1 is adapted from Catherine Beecher, Essay on Slavery and Abolitionism, originally published in 1837. So this is around the time of the Civil War. Passage 2 is adapted from Angelina E. Grimke, Letters to Catherine Beecher. So looks like the first passage is an essay by Beecher about slavery and abolitionism. The second is actually going to be a response to Catherine Beecher from this other lady. Originally published in 1838. Okay. Grimke encouraged Southern women to oppose slavery publicly. So right away this is what Grimke's about. She wants Southern women to be public in their opposal of slavery. That's really important. That they give you this sentence right here is so helpful, because now if you're ever struggling when you're reading the second passage, which is the one by Grimke, you can remember what Grimke believes is that women should oppose slavery publicly, and it can help center you if you're ever getting frazzled and confused. Okay, passage 1 is Beecher's response to Grimke's views. So this first passage is actually Beecher responding to this idea of Grimke's that you should oppose slavery publicly. Passage 2 is Grimke's response to Beecher. So then Grimke responds back to Beecher's response. So it's almost like Grimke believes this thing, Beecher responds to that in the first passage, Grimke responds back to Beecher in the next one. So hopefully that's not confusing. Hopefully that makes sense and helps you understand where we're going as we go into the passage. Remember, this is about women, this is about slavery, both in one passage. All right, and we're going to hit some different sounding language. This is older language, but hopefully I'll be able to explain basically what it's saying so that it doesn't confuse you. Passage 1. Heaven has appointed to one sex the superior, and to the other the subordinate station, and this without any reference to the character or conduct of either. Okay? Heaven, meaning God, God has made one sex superior to the other. So one up here, and the other one's subordinate, which means it would answer to the one up here. So I'm assuming that it's male up here and female down here, just because how things are. Male, I'm assuming she's going to say the male is a superior and the other one is subordinate. And this without any reference to the character or conduct of either. So it doesn't matter how good people are, what they do. This is literally just basically how things are. This is just how God made things. That's what she's saying. It is therefore as much for the dignity as it is for the interest of females, in all respects, to conform to the duties of this relation. So she's saying this is a good thing for females to take this subordinate station. It is, whoops, that's a weird arrow. That's supposed to be an arrow. It is good and it is dignified of them to take this subordinate station. So she isn't one of the ladies back then who thought that ladies should take on everything that men did. While woman holds a subordinate relation in society to the other sex, men, it is not because it was designed that her duties or her influence should be any the less important. This is super important. This first paragraph is the gist of her argument. So even though women have a subordinate station, they're under men in a way, their duties and their influence. Oh shoot, that's hard. That's still influence. You can see that. Her duties and her influence doesn't mean her duties and influence should be any the less important. So even though she has different station, doesn't mean it's less important. And that's a super important nuance to her argument. It's not that what she does isn't important, it's just different. Shouldn't be less important or all pervading, so it still can have influence over a lot of people. She's not confined by this. But it was designed that the mode of gaining influence and of exercising power should be altogether different and peculiar. Peculiar basically means different. Those are synonyms of each other. Okay, just to recap this first paragraph, it's a little complex. Men have been given a superior role, women an inferior role. They're subordinate to men, but that doesn't mean women are less important. That doesn't mean what they do is less important. It just means that they do different things, and they do those things that they do differently than men do. Okay, let's see the next paragraph. A man, so it's describing men, a man may act on society by the collision of intellect. I'm just going to circle words like this. Collision of intellect in public debate. He may urge his measures by a sense of shame, by fear, and by personal interest. He may coerce by the combination of public sentiment. He may drive by physical force, and he does not outstep the boundaries of his fear. So men can do these certain things, these words like collision, public, urge, coerce, drive, doesn't put them outside of what they were made to do, of the sphere that they were made to act inside of. Okay, so men can do these type of things, but all the power and all the conquests that are lawful to woman are those only which appear to the kindly, generous, peaceful, and benevolent principles. So men can be this way, but women, the only things that women, the things that they should be doing in the sphere that they've been given is being kind, being generous, being peaceful and benevolent. Woman is to win everything by peace and love, by making herself so much respected, esteemed, and loved that to yield to her opinions and to gratify her wishes will be the free will offering of the heart. So woman has no words like debate, urge, collision, coerce, drive. This is about love and peace and kindness and just winning people over through love, basically, instead of through force. But this is to be all accomplished in the domestic and social circle. So not only do women have to do things differently than men, they were made to do things differently, they're also made to do them in a different place. So instead of the public sphere, they were made to act in the social and domestic, that means at home, the social and domestic circles. There let every woman become so cultivated and refined in intellect that her taste and judgment will be respected, so benevolent in feeling and action that her motives will be reverenced, so unassuming and unambitious that collision and competition will be banished, so gentle and easy to be entreated as that every heart will repose in her presence. Then the fathers, the husbands, and the sons will find an influence thrown around them, to which they will yield not only willingly but proudly. So we have women being a totally different way than men, in a different place, but still influencing the men in their lives in a lovely way. So, men and women, different roles, different duties that they should do. Men can act more forcefully. Women are supposed to act in love and in a different place, not publicly, but privately. And then they can influence the men in their lives that way. That's basically what she said so far. A woman may seek the aid of cooperation and combination among her own sex to assist her in her appropriate offices of piety, charity, maternal and domestic duty. So basically, women can get together with other women to do things, but only in the proper sphere, only in the home, only in the social circle. But whatever, in any measure, throws a woman into the attitude of a combatant, either for herself or others, whatever binds her in a party of conflict, whatever obliges her in any way to exert coercive influences, throws her out of her appropriate sphere. So, again, the idea of having two different spheres, men doing things over in this place and women doing things over in this other place. She's saying if a woman ever starts to fight, um, do anything in a combatant way, it's not a part of what she has been made to do. And finally, the last sentence, this is her big concluding sentence. This is her main point here. If these general principles are correct, they are entirely opposed to the plan of arraying females in any abolition movement. So what she's leading up to is basically, I don't agree with you, Grimke. I don't think women should be a part in this public, it's important, this public abolition movement. I don't think that's part of our job. Okay, as always, let us quickly summarize here before moving to passage 2 so that we don't get anything confused. 2 roles, men having a more forceful role, women having a more gentle, loving role. Both of those roles having their own type of influence, and women's influence not being less pervading or less important, just different. And women can get together with other women, but only in their right spheres. Women shouldn't try to merge into the men's roles. Because of this, she says, I don't think women should be a part of the abolition movement. Bam. That is passage 1. Not bad. Passage 2. So remember now, this is Grimke responding to what Beecher said in the last passage. The investigation of the rights of the slave has led me to a better understanding of my own. I have found the anti-slavery cause to be the high school of morals in our land. Okay? The school in which human rights are more fully investigated and better understood and taught than in any other. So as she's looked at the rights of slaves, she's realized that it's helping her understand better, in general, human rights, all of our rights. So when she says to be the high school of morals, it's like a preparatory school, right? It's taking you from one place and bringing you to an even higher place. So starting with understanding slavery has led to even a greater understanding of human rights in general. Here, a great fundamental principle is uplifted and illuminated, and from this central light, rays innumerable stream all around. So from this one idea, everything is, we see a lot more. We get a lot more truth from this one thing. And let us see what this one great fundamental principle is. Human beings have rights because they are moral beings. So she's going to use this phrase a lot. The rights of all men grow out of their moral nature. And as all men have the same moral nature, they have essentially the same rights. This is her basic argument. So people are moral beings. So because of that, from that moral being, whatever she means by that, their rights flow from that. And since all people are the same, all men have the same moral nature, then they have the same rights. These rights may be wrested from the slave, but they cannot be alienated. His title to himself is as perfect now as is that of Lyman Beecher. So even though we try to take these rights away from people, it doesn't mean that they don't have them anymore. They still have those rights. They in the past though, they just tried to take them away. Wrested means like taken. These rights can be taken from the slave. So Lyman Beecher, by the way, I believe it's this Beecher's father. It is stamped on his moral being, and it is like it imperishable. So our rights are just a part of literally who we are made to be. And it's not something that can be taken away, Even if people try to take it away or act like we don't have them, we still do, all of us. Same rights because we have the same moral being. Now, if rights are founded in the nature of our moral being, then the mere circumstance of sex does not give to man higher rights and responsibilities than to women. So, if our rights are just based on our moral being and we all have the same moral being, it shouldn't matter if we're men or women. We should have the same exact rights. To suppose that it does would be to deny the self-evident truth that the physical constitution is the mere instrument of the moral nature. So if you think about stuff, this is the umbrella, and there's all other stuff inside. Moral nature is going to be governing everything else. And physical constitution, she means sex, will be underneath it. So moral nature will say, will be above, will be governing over physical constitution. Physical constitution won't be determining everything. Moral nature will be. To suppose that it does would be to break up utterly the relations of the two natures. So when this is a little confusing to me, but when she says two natures, she's talking about the physical nature and the moral nature. So to suppose that physical nature governs over moral nature would be to reverse their functions, exalting the animal nature into a monarch, so making whatever sex you are the main determiner, as if it's the king, and humbling the moral into a slave, so making your moral nature just the slave of your physical nature, making the former a proprietor, wow, that's hard, proprietor, which would be the owner of property, and the latter is property. So she's saying this is just going to mix everything up. If our moral nature governs our rights, why do we make our physical nature govern the rights? It doesn't make sense. When human beings are regarded as moral beings, sex, instead of being enthroned upon the summit, so instead of physical nature being up here, administering upon the rights and responsibilities sinks into insignificance and nothingness. So she says physical nature, really not that important. It should sink into insignificance. The main idea, the main important thing is the moral nature and that we have all the same rights. My doctrine then is, main point here, that whatever it is morally right for a man to do, it is morally right for a woman to do. So, because we have the same moral nature, men and women should be able to do the same things. Come on, guys. Our duties originate not from the difference of sex, but from the diversity of our relations in life, the various gifts and talents committed to our care, and the different eras in which we live. So, what we should be doing, is not determined by what sex we are. It's just determined by the person we are in general, the things that we're good at, the opportunities we have, and the time in which we live. So the second passage was obviously quite a bit more confusing, more complex. She's basically saying, in summary, that all of us, that as she's learned with slavery, from there she's realized that all humans have rights, and that's determined by their moral being. Everybody has the same moral nature, so they all have the same rights. And we shouldn't make sex more important and more determinative of our rights than our moral nature. It'd mess everything up. Finally, sex really shouldn't be that important, so men and women should be able to do anything they would like to do. Anything that's moral for one should be moral for the other. Doesn't matter. Okay. Okay, good. I thought almost that I had missed a little section there. Passage 1. Men and women have different duties. Women should stay in their circle and not try to go into the men's circle. So therefore, women shouldn't participate in this movement. Passage 2. Men and women should have the same rights. We all have the same nature, so we should have the same rights. Those are basic summaries. Those are the type of summaries I make in my head after I have read passages when I'm actually doing the test. Beautiful. Okay. Let's go to our final passage. This one was interesting, I guess. Let's enjoy it as much as we can. whole food blues, why organic agriculture may not be so sustainable. So this might be an interesting take on the thing, because most people think, oh yeah, organic is probably better, but they're saying maybe it's not so sustainable. So right ahead with this title, we kind of know the gist of what's going to happen, where our brains are ready to receive whatever this has to give us. When it comes to energy, everyone loves efficiency. Cutting energy waste is one of those goals that both sides of the political divide can agree on, even if they sometimes diverge on how best to get there. Energy efficiency allows us to get more out of our given resources, which is good for the economy and mostly good for the environment as well. In an increasingly hot and crowded world, the only sustainable way to live is to get more out of less. Every environmentalist would agree. So we start off with a point that everybody would agree on, even people from different political backgrounds. Republicans and Democrats and other people would agree on this. It's good to be efficient. It's good to get more out of less. But he's going to bring in another point, but change the conversation to food. And suddenly efficiency doesn't look so good. So something changes when we start talking about food, then there's disagreement over what's efficient. Conventional industrial agriculture has become incredibly efficient on a simple land to food basis. So how people do agriculture normally is very efficient. Thanks to fertilizers, mechanization, and irrigation, each American farmer feeds over 155 people worldwide. Conventional farming gets more and more crop per square foot of cultivated land. Over 170 bushels of corn per acre in Iowa, for example, which can mean less territory needs to be converted from wilderness to farmland. So, conventional farmers get a lot of food out of their land. And so it means that they don't have to convert wilderness to farmland as much. So it actually does. It's incredibly efficient that way. And it's good for the environment because it's not destroying more wilderness land. And since a third of the planet is already used for agriculture, that's a lot, destroying forests and other wild habitats along the way, anything that could help us produce more food on less land would seem to be good for the environment. So again, the idea of more out of less. Here we have more food out of less land, which is something that the conventional industrial agriculture people are able to do. So they're good at getting more food out of less land. This would seem to be good for the environment. So we've looked at everybody wants efficiency. Conventional agriculture actually seems to be pretty efficient. You get a lot of food out of a little land. Moving on. Of course, that's not how most environmentalists regard their arugula. Arugula is really gross, in my opinion. A leafy green. They have embraced organic food as better for the planet. So now we've looked at conventional agriculture. Now, in contrast, we've got organic food. They think that's actually better and healthier and tastier too. So not only is it good for the planet, it tastes better, according to them. It tastes better than the stuff produced by agriculture corporations. Environmentalists disdain the enormous amounts of energy needed and the waste created by conventional farming. While organic practices, foregoing artificial fertilizers and chemical pesticides, are considered far more sustainable. So environmentalists don't like conventional agriculture. Why? Because it uses up lots of energy and it creates a lot of waste. In contrast, organic people don't use these artificial fertilizers and don't use the chemical pesticides. And they're considered far more sustainable. Sales of organic food rose 7.7% in 2010, up to 26.7 billion. And people are making those purchases for their consciences as much as their taste buds. So they feel like it's better for the planet. They don't use the pesticides and the fertilizers. So it cuts down on waste and on energy used. And it tastes good. Okay? Yet, so every new paragraph, we get this new idea coming in. Yet, a new meta-analysis in Nature, so a study here, does the math and comes to a hard conclusion. Organic farming yields 25% fewer on crops on average than conventional agriculture. So when you look at the numbers, organic agriculture gives a lot less out of the land. So on 1 acre, they're going to get a quarter less crop yield than a conventional farmer would. More land is therefore needed to produce fewer crops, and that means organic farming may not be as good for the planet as we think. So in the beginning, we see how conventional agriculture uses less land and they get more food. In contrast, even though there's some good things about this organic agriculture, it actually uses up more land because it can't produce as many crops as conventional agriculture can. Let's see where he takes this. In the Nature analysis, so the same study, scientists from McGill University in Montreal and the University of Minnesota performed an analysis of 66 studies comparing conventional and organic methods across 34 different crop species, from fruits to grains to legumes. They found that the organic farming delivered a lower yield for every crop type. So they always produce less, every single crop type. So the disparity varied widely. So how much it varied, how much less it produced varies. I said that confusingly, but the next couple sentences will help. For rainwater legume crops like beans or perennial crops like fruit trees, organic trailed conventional agriculture by just 5%. So some of them were only less by just a little bit, 5%. Yet, for major cereal crops like corn or wheat, as well as most vegetables, all of which provide the bulk of the world's calories, conventional agriculture outperformed organics by more than 25%. So there's some small numbers here, it was only less by 5%, and then some less by 25%. So there's a big range as to how well it performs. The main difference is nitrogen, the chemical key to plant growth. Conventional agriculture makes use of 171 million metric tons of synthetic fertilizer each year. A lot of synthetic fertilizer, which I assume has that nitrogen in it. And all that nitrogen enables much faster plant growth than the slower release of nitrogen from compost or cover crops used in organic farming. So they both use nitrogen. Conventional agriculture just tries to use it synthetically, and it releases nitrogen faster with the synthetic one. Whereas when they try to use compost and cover crops in organic farming, it just goes slower. It's just how it is. When we talk about a green revolution, we really mean a nitrogen revolution along with a lot of water. So basically, the reason that this organic agriculture can't produce as much is they just don't have that huge boost of nitrogen that the conventional agriculture gives to the crops. But not all the nitrogen used in conventional fertilizer ends up in crops. Much of it ends up running off the soil and into the oceans, creating vast polluted dead zones. So this is a negative side for the conventional. Even though it helps plants grow a lot, this is running into the ocean and creating dead zones in the ocean. That's not good. We're already putting more nitrogen into the soil than the planet can stand over the long term. And conventional agriculture also depends heavily on chemical pesticides, which can have unintended side effects. So we're seeing some negatives on both sides. Organic agriculture uses up more land, but then conventional agriculture uses so much fertilizer that it's harming our planet. What that means, drawing to an end, he's deciding what all of this should mean, what he should do about it. What that means is that while conventional agriculture is more efficient, sometimes much more efficient than organic farming, there are trade-offs with each. So there's good and bad on both sides. So an ideal global agricultural system, in the views of the study's authors, may borrow the best from both systems, as Jonathan Foley of the University of Minnesota explained. The bottom line, today's organic farming practices are probably best deployed in fruit and vegetable farms, where growing nutrition, not just bulk calories, is the primary goal. But for delivering sheer calories, especially in our staple crops of wheat, rice, maize, soybeans, and so on, conventional farms have the advantage right now. So his idea is to to try to exploit the best qualities about these different types of farming. So with organic farming, which only produces 5% less than conventional farming, um, it's good to use that because you can get better fruit, better vegetables, and not use so much of that nitrogen. With other farming, like wheat, rice, maize, soybeans, it often produces a lot less. So for that, we should use the nitrogen. So there's kind of a oh, what's the word? I'm forgetting the word right now. They're making a compromise. There it is. They're making a compromise and using different types of farming for different vegetables. Not vegetables, different foods. Looking forward, I think we will need to deploy different kinds of practices, especially new mixed approaches that take the best of organic and conventional farming systems. So again, compromise, mixing the approaches where they are best suited geographically, economically, socially, etc. Okay, time to summarize. Everybody loves efficiency. We want to get, all of us want to get more out of less. Conventional farming does get more out of less. It gets more food out of less land. So that's great. We don't have to destroy other land and turn it into farmland. But for some reason, and they'll tell us, environmentalists don't think that way. They think that organic farming is better because it uses less energy and doesn't produce so much waste. They don't use fertilizers, they don't use pesticides, so it's better. Yet, this new study suggests that organic farming yields a lot less. So that's a problem. But then they find some products, some foods yield 25% less, some only 5%. So there's this variety of how much it yields. And that's because plants need this nitrogen. And conventional agriculture uses synthetic stuff. Then again, synthetic stuff can be bad for the planet. So there's bad things about both. They finally decide the best idea is to simply use certain types of farming for certain types of crops and other types for other types. So organic farming for the fruit and the vegetables that still produce pretty much as the same amount as the conventional, and then for the crops that need that nitrogen boost, conventional farming. So through lots of different twists and turns in his logic, he lands at the idea of a compromise. All right, that will be the end for today. We did the first 3 passages of practice test 5. And so next Friday, we will move on to the last 2 passages, which, okay, this one's going to be the social science. So we're going to have a social science and a science coming up next Friday.